Welcome to the show, everyone. Today we are diving deep into the world of Google AdWords for personal injury attorneys. And I have a fantastic guest with me who is going to break down everything you need to know about running smarter, more effective campaigns. So let's just jump right in. For attorneys who are just starting to explore Google AdWords, what would you say is the very first thing they need to understand before they even spend a single dollar?
Well, first they need to understand what the cost is for Google AdWords, right?
Right, and that's such a crucial starting point because personal injury is one of the most competitive spaces in all of Google advertising. So, can you break that down for us? When we're talking about cost, what are we actually looking at for a personal injury attorney running ads on Google?
So when we're thinking about cost or when we're talking about cost, you're thinking about a budget, right? And not every campaign is always going to be the same because every attorney is different, even though they're in the PI space or the personal injury space. Um, so it really depends on what their niches are within the umbrella of personal injury, right? So like, let's say medical malpractice, right? In medical malpractice, the keywords are far cheaper than, car accidents for attorneys. Even though they're under the same PI umbrella, they're just completely different. And so the cost change. But also, too, the conversions change because someone that is in a car accident, it's easy to understand that there's damages and, that you're going to sue the insurance company. But for medical malpractice, it could be far more complicated, getting cases because there's things like the free kill law. And there's, things that go into the case that needs to be reviewed by an expert medical professional. And so there's additional costs to just, getting the case and then what happens after the fact. So at least from a Google AdWords perspective, I tend to look at things to go from the end point of the conversion, or rather the end of the case, and work my way backwards towards the beginning of things. So that way I have a good and deep understanding of exactly how to create the best campaigns for these attorneys.
Wow, okay, that is such a golden insight right there. Working backwards from the end of the case to build the campaign. That's a framework that I think a lot of attorneys and even marketers, honestly, have never considered. So let's unpack that a little bit. When you say you start from the end point, are you talking about things like the average case value, the settlement amount, and then using that to figure out what a reasonable cost per acquisition should be for that attorney?
Absolutely, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Especially, so having a fundamental understanding of what your average case value is, you can start calculating what your costs are going to start looking like and what a realistic budget should be set for Google AdWords in order to create the best campaign for AdWords. And it's also about interconnecting like connecting all the systems together that feeds into Google AdWords in order to create the campaigns, right? So let's say, for example, you're starting a brand new slate on Google AdWords. You're going to want to do maximize clicks first just to start getting campaign data, but you also need to set up all the call trackings, all the integrations into the systems so it can be like the best possible campaign for the attorney in order, right? Because the goal is for them to generate the highest return possible for these campaigns.
Yes, and that word integration is so key there because a lot of attorneys might think that Google AdWords is just, set it and forget it, throw some money at it, and leads come in. But what you're describing is really an ecosystem, right? Everything has to be talking to each other. So, can you walk us a little deeper into that? What are some of those critical systems that need to be connected and feeding data back into Google AdWords to really make those campaigns perform at their best?
Right. So I guess for simplicity's sake, and from my experience, so far what I've found is the best campaigns are things that you can interconnect, and there's tools for that. Some of them are like CallRail. What Converts, which is my favorite. I definitely would recommend What Converts because it's a CRM, very easy to use, and it's super easy to connect into Google AdWords and into external campaign or external CRMs too, depending if you're using HubSpot, Salesforce, or custom things like Silo, or any attorney specific CRM that allows them to understand, where the lead is coming in from and their process through the journey, so it's from start to finish. And then that way also too, it's easier for intake and also for the client in case, they call and wanted an update on, their legal, their legal process and where they're at. And so, it really depends on what you want to do and provide, all of it depends on the goals of the attorney.
Thing, right? So, George, when you're building out those campaigns, are you going after broad terms like personal injury attorney, or are you getting really specific and granular with things like truck accident lawyer Miami type of keywords? And how does that decision impact the cost per click?
So when looking at broad terms, you kind of need to use broad terms if you want to use the smart bidding option for Google AdWords. So it's important to have a comprehensive negative list that blocks out a lot of irrelevant terms. And so once that's done with the whole filtering process, you can then target specific things like truck accident lawyer Miami and very localized terms. So that impacts the decisions that I make because I have to look at what's most beneficial for the attorney, right? And a lot of times bidding on a broad term like personal injury is not going to generate the right conversions. You'll have a higher conversion rate for truck accident lawyer versus personal injury. And I know this because we were ranking at the top for personal injury for a few months. And, for Percy, one of my clients, it wasn't really generating enough conversions, even though like the cost was extremely high. So once we started, focusing on very niche or very specific keywords, the conversion rates started to increase. And so it started to make more sense that we could invest more into Google AdWords.
That is such a powerful real world example, George. And it really drives home the point that more traffic does not always mean better results. So, as we start to wrap things up here, with 14 years of experience, all the tools, the data, the legal background, if you could leave our listeners with just one piece of advice, one thing an attorney should do before they even spend a single dollar on Google AdWords, what would that be?
I would first integrate a system that allows me to capture all of the data sets into one hub. And from there, I can start actually advertising and, doing SEO, doing Google AdWords, doing Bing, and doing all these other channels. So that way I have a good understanding of where my money is being spent, how is it being spent, what am I getting out of it, where are they coming from, so it gives you a 360 view of marketing as a whole.
George, that is the perfect note to end on. A 360-degree view of your marketing before you spend a single dollar. That is wisdom that applies not just to personal injury attorneys, but honestly to any business owner out there. Jorge Argota of Argota Marketing, thank you so much for sharing your expertise today. This has been an incredibly valuable conversation. And to our listeners, if you took nothing else away from today, remember, data first, advertising second. Thanks everyone for tuning in.